Good evening and welcome. I hope you can hear me all. If I can get some quick reactions. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. On behalf of Plaksha University, I want to welcome you all to our first Tech Talk. Plaksha University, which is going to come up in Chandigarh next year, is an initiative of 80 technology entrepreneurs and business leaders. One of our key objectives is to harness the power of technology to solve some of the biggest challenges that our planet faces. One of those challenges is higher education. Still, only 1 in 4 students in India is able to go to college. Online education has been around for a long time, but online education has really played second fiddle to classroom teaching. We've all been home for the last 1 month now. We've been meeting online, we've been learning online. And some of us are starting to say, hey, this works pretty well. So is online education here to stay? Can online education transform higher education? What do schools and colleges need to do to adapt to this new form of learning? There's nobody better to answer these questions than Professor Sanjay Sarma. Sanjay did his undergraduate engineering at IIT Kanpur and then did his PhD at UC Berkeley. He's a professor of mechanical engineering at MIT. MIT has one of the most robust platforms in online learning globally. In 2015, in a report titled The Future of Higher Education, MIT's stated objective was to be able to teach the world. Sanjay not only led the task force that authored that report, but he also leads MIT's digital initiatives for the last few years. I'm delighted to welcome Sanjay as he unravels the future of higher education. Sanjay is going to be speaking for about 25 minutes, post which we'll have a Q&A session. I will request all of you to hold on to your questions till Sanjay stops speaking. Also, you will see that you have a Q&A feature and a chat feature both on your screens. Please use the Q&A feature to type out your questions. Don't use the chat feature. So with that brief introduction, on behalf of Plaksha, I welcome you again. Thanks, Sanjay, for doing this, and over to you.
Thank you, Vineet, and thank you, everyone. Let me share my screen here to get going. These are very strange and special times, and I wanted to speak today not so much as an MIT professor, although I will speak a little bit about MIT, but more just as an educator in these special times. So let's start by looking at higher ed. So I'll start actually by looking at the history of higher education. And it's very interesting that the history of higher education, I call it education BC. Now, BC, of course, means in common parlance, before Christ or before the common era. I actually think it should be called before COVID. And I'll tell you why. The reason is, if you look at the history of universities, and I'm really talking about universities here, the first university was actually in South Asia, in Pakistan, Takshila. And it goes back to the 6th century AD, BC. And now I'm talking about the true BC, before the Common Era. And there's some tremendous work on this, the history by Professor Shailendra Mehta, who's now at MICA. You should check it out. But at Takshila, these ancient Indian scientists, the greater India, I should say, invented many of the things that we now take for granted in universities. That tradition over the years got lost outside of the South Asian continent. But there was some ripple effects. There was Nalanda, there was, and a bunch of other universities that were established over the years. But then, if you look at the history of universities, the Islamic tradition starts taking over. And it's a pretty glorious history that we don't give them credit for. We should. It's extraordinary, actually. For example, there is the University of Al-Qarawiyyin, which is in Morocco, which was actually established by a lady. Her name was Fatima Al-Fihri in 859 AD. It is the longest running university that we know of. And the word university comes from a very interesting composition of words. In Latin, it is the Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium. So it really is the guild or the association of teachers and scholars. And even the concept of a degree comes from there. And you will know this in India, it comes from the word ijazat, which means permission or degree. You have the right now to teach. And most universities historically came from religious schools. So the University of Al-Qarawiyyin was a Islamic university. And if you had the ijazat to teach the Quran or aspects of the Quran. But what is strange is that this tradition from initially starting in Takshila, although some of that was lost, and then restarting in Islam. By the way, this is a picture of the ijazat. This is the degree. It's beautiful. And if you could read Arabic, probably isn't that different than a degree that you might get today. Now, what is strange is that if you now look at the universities of the famous universities around the world, and for reasons I'll explain in a minute, I don't put a picture of MIT here because it doesn't look quite the same. But on the top left is Oxford University, bottom is Harvard University, and the top right is Stanford University. They still have that same monastic sort of look. They're all still monasteries. In other words, people went there to study the Holy Book, and they were closed. In fact, the term is cloister, right? You go inside and you study. And it was not about being a public square. It was going in to be remote. To this day, many universities are remote. They're far away. They might be on a hill. They're away from the town. The town may have come to them, but they're away and they're separate. I didn't put MIT there because the MIT campus doesn't look the same. MIT is a relatively recent university. Oxford was established almost 1,000 years ago, Harvard about 400 years ago. Stanford is relatively new, but it followed the tradition. MIT was actually established as a place where people could learn by doing. And so the campus is beautiful, but it's much more the inside. It's high bays, and it's all about workshops and factories, because technology was a new word in 1861 when the charter for MIT was established. But the traditional university looks like the monastery. And then something strange happened. It unfolded, as you know, starting in November, December, January. It's a little controversial exactly when it started. Maybe it even started in November. It was circulating and only jumped to humans and started spreading more widely late November, early December. And that is COVID-19. And we as humanity were sitting around, frankly, complacently. And COVID came along and did something very strange. You know, if I'd written a science fiction story in March last year, that's about a year ago, saying that aliens landed on the planet and they stole proximity. It would have seemed like a very strange story. It wasn't aliens. It was viruses, which have been part of the ecosystem forever, that have stolen proximity from us. And that actually is a very, of course, tragic situation. It is impacting people unequally. Frankly, the rich are not suffering as much as the poor. People who work with their minds are not suffering as much as the people who work with their hands. But it's also an opportunity to examine humanity in general and education in particular. So I'm going to do that in a few minutes. See, COVID changes everything. As you know, supply chains will never be the same again. A lot of supply chains that depended on supply from China are now suffering, whether it's Apple products or even pharmaceuticals, like the active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs in medicines. So supply chains will be more local. They'll become more resilient. In other words, they'll be more distributed. I don't see Apple putting all its manufacturing in one country ever again. I think it'll be, they'll have to spread them out. And the supply chains become much more delivery oriented, which is delivered to the home. Retail has been devastated because people can't go to retail stores. Healthcare has to be rethought. And this is not just in America, but in the rest of the world. How we test, how we measure, do population surveillance, home healthcare, telemedicine, especially with an aging population in some countries like the United States and China and Japan and Europe, less so in India or in the Middle East or Africa. especially with an aging population, there's going to be a lot of telemedicine. The pharmaceutical industry is being transformed. We are, for the first time in humanity, going to try and get a virus out within 1 year. And MIT is deeply embedded in this. So obviously, I'm keeping track of it because we have to figure out the future of in-person education. MIT shut down, or I should say ramped down, and sent undergraduates home to avoid a spread in the community in March, about a month ago. And all the universities have since, I'll show you more about that. And we have to figure out when we ramp back up. And so for that, we're looking at the dynamics of this pandemic. And then we have to think about the dynamics, not just in Boston, but in Massachusetts, not just in Massachusetts, but in neighboring states, the rest of America, and the rest of the world. Because this pandemic is going to bounce around until we have a vaccine in hand or we have therapeutics. Travel has been devastated. Airports are not the same that they were even a month ago. You have flights flying with 1 or 0 people. Manufacturing has been transformed. Suddenly, Tesla is making ventilators, and companies that make clothes are making masks. And even Hollywood and Bollywood have been transformed. The new Bond movie, can they release it to a theater now? I doubt it, because no one will go to theaters. But Netflix is winning. And so maybe a lot of Hollywood movies will go straight to Netflix or Hulu or whatever the service is that you're used to. So we've talked about every industry other than education. Well, education has been devastated. There are 1.5 billion students working from, or not working, just sitting at home. I mean, this is the UNESCO map that I show you here, and you can see the extent of the impact. It's actually 1.6 billion as of now. That's 91.3% of all eligible learners, 188 countrywide shutdowns. Here's the tragedy. Very few of them are taking advantage of online facilities. I'm a little heartbroken to see that my alma mater, IIT, I don't think is doing much in online. We're just sitting around waiting for something to happen. The United States is a different picture, actually. In the United States, almost 4,500 higher ed institutions have been impacted by this. And they have had to do the same thing, which is ramp down and send their students away from campus. And that's 25 million students who are now at home. This is pretty incredible. So let's talk a little bit about what this means, this strange, surreal situation that's been imposed on us by something we cannot see. And it's not an alien. It is a member of the planet that has attacked us. Well, the way to think about it is that actually this strange natural experiment, which has stolen proximity from us, is actually an opportunity for us to examine what we stand for. What is education? What is learning? What does it mean to be on campus? Why be on campus if it's a residential campus? Why go to a university if you stay at home and go by bus? Why not just work by Zoom or by WebEx or any other format, FaceTime, WhatsApp? What's so special about being at a university? You know, if I showed you the history starts in BC, but nothing has changed as of a month and a half ago. We still go to universities and sit in classrooms and do exactly the same thing that students did a couple of thousand years ago. So let's talk about that. So this is actually a lecture from MIT. Now, I'm going to use this example to paint the bigger picture that I want to paint. So this is my dear colleague, Jeff Grossman. And he'll be a little bit appalled to see that I'm using his picture here. But Jeff, if you're watching, just wait, don't worry. I'll say nice things about you. Now, in this lecture, he's standing at in a podium, at the well, in the well of a classroom. This classroom is, I believe, 10 to 50, which is a major big classroom, very historic classroom at MIT where Nobel laureates give lectures from and so on. And the students are sitting there. So what has happened post-COVID? Well, post-COVID, we can't be together. So what has happened is Jeff and the students have been separated and they're connected to each other through the internet. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that we're using FaceTime classes. So the classrooms have become like this. Now, I had the honor last month of leading a team along with my dear colleague, Professor Krishna Rajagopal, of taking 1,251 classes online after we send the students home. We did not stop our classes. We said we would just move right on. Now, it helps that MIT has a lot of preparation in this space, which I'll come to in a minute. I won't spend too much time on it. But in fact, all the 4,250 universities and institutions in the world did not throw up their hands in the air and give up. We all decided we will continue. And so the students fired up their Zoom, professors fired up Zoom at home. So this picture, which actually I got off the internet, it's actually not from MIT. You can see the professors at home and the students are at home. And this is universities and it's schools, and people are just moving on. Not all of them, but many of them. And it's very impressive to see the dedication to keeping the music playing. It's very inspiring and I'm very pleased about it. Now, at some point though, proximity will be restored. And the question to you is, given that retail will never be the same, given that healthcare will never be the same, given that the supply chain will never be the same, for those of us in the education community, are we going to go back to exactly the same old thing? Will Jeff walk into the classroom and just give the same lecture that he gave on Zoom? I think that would be a tragedy. And that's really the gist of what I want to say to you. In fact, the good news is Jeff never, ever simply gave a lecture, because he walks into every classroom with an amazing set of hands-on experiments, thinking aids, and then we have labs, workshops, maker sessions, recitations. Students examine the problem from 5 different directions. They don't get one direction, and then they go to the professor or the TA, and it's almost like psychoanalysis. We fix it. And when the students are done, they get it. They absolutely get it. Yeah, we did this at the IITs too, because we all had to talk to each other and figure things out. But this is not the common situation in universities. In the common situation in universities is what professors do in the classroom, they could equally do on Zoom, and the proximity is overrated. But at MIT and at many universities around the world, proximity is actually taken advantage of with those things like those props there. And you can see the look on the student's face who is completely engaged, and they are drawn into this. And the amount of work that goes into preparing a lecture for proximity is tremendous. It's like a show, and the students absolutely love it, and they're dying to come back. But for the vast fraction of academia, I doubt they're dying to come back. For the vast fraction of academia, there is no big advantage to being together. There's actually a lot of science that shows, and I'll spare you all the details of this, that what makes you learn is curiosity. There's actually 2 papers, one from my colleagues group, that's Professor John Gabrielli, and what he showed was that there was a certain learning state that they couldn't explain, in which students suddenly started learning really well. And another group at the University of California came up with, that's by Professor Ranganath, showed that that state in which they learn is what in English we refer to as curiosity. And it turns out that if you can trigger curiosity, the brain starts generating a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And this is called the dopaminergic circuit, and it gets activated. And if you go back to my picture of Jeff's classroom when proximity is restored and when we're together, it is all about getting students engaged, getting them work with their brains and their hands. In fact, MIT's logo and MIT's sort of central tenet is mens et manus, mind and hand, get both engaged. And you can only do that when you're together. But the fact of the matter is most universities don't take advantage of it. And what they do is what we've been doing for thousands of years. This is a picture of a classroom from 1308 AD. Okay, how is this different from your classroom today? It's exactly the same thing. And in fact, even in this picture, you can see this gentleman in the purple in the front is sleeping. We should not go back to a normal, which was not the right normal, a normal in which students aren't engaged and they might just as well be home. We should go to a normal where we don't clip their dreams. I mean, this is what I feel a lot of education does. Students come with dreams and we sort of clip them into a shape like a cookie cutter that is convenient to us. We have to find the new normal. Now, MIT is very lucky because for the last 20 years, we've been preparing for online. So we launched OpenCourseWare in 2001. 350 million people have gone to MIT OpenCourseWare and downloaded courses. We launched MITx and edX in 2011, 2012. By the way, the CEO of edX, Anant Agarwal, is in my view, a hero in the space. He's a graduate of IIT Madras, and then he went to Stanford and he's a professor here. We launched edX in 2012, MITx in 2011, and we took really amazing professors and we put them online for the world to see. And now when coronavirus strikes us, we have all these facilities we can take advantage of. This gentleman is Eric Lander. He's one of the people who led one of the two big teams to sequence the human genome. And when Eric speaks, for me, and I've seen this lecture again and again, it is a pleasure because I know that he knows deep in his heart what makes biology work. And he's passionate about it. And we have this content, we prepared. And so we were ready for coronavirus. So universities, when they go back to normal, have to rethink themselves. Please don't go back to normal and do what you did pre-COVID, because Zoom does what you did before for a lot of us just as well. We have to go back and become a place of action, creation, and impact. I'm talking about labs, I'm talking about projects. I'm talking about empowering students to be ready for the new world. The other place where I think universities need to really sort of rethink their mission and their role in the world is the future of work. Jobs are changing so fast. Faculty have to become more industry savvy. And lest someone should accuse me of being insensitive to the humanities, I actually think the humanities are going to become even more important in the 21st century because design, aesthetics, culture, social awareness are becoming even more relevant, and the iPhone to me is a piece of art as much as it's a piece of technology. And it's based on, and it's a cultural revolution as well. And if you look at jobs worldwide today, and this is a complicated chart, it's from McKinsey, but what it shows is that the jobs that have the highest share of the economy, that is to the right, and the jobs that will be displaced most are correlated. In other words, the places where economy employs the most people are the places where workers will be displaced by new technologies, such as telehealth, such as online delivery, such as, at-home delivery in the supply chain, such as online commerce, such as advertising in an online world, and so on, or biotech, or neuroscience. And so your education does not end at the end of your undergrad. Your education is going to continue for the rest of your life. It's like saying somehow that you need to just work out for the first 4 years of your adult life, and then you're fit for the rest of your life. We all know that to stay fit, one has to exercise or go to a gym or something several times a week. And disruptions are in our future, whether it's climate change or this pandemic, or frankly, social disruption. This is a picture from Santiago de Chile in Chile. Out of the blue, a country that seemed very stable, suddenly there was social disruption and schools and universities were shut down for a long time. So I'll end by saying that proximity, the ability, the luxury of being together, is something we all now covet, we miss, and we need it, and we want it. It's the elixir of the future. But if we get it back, let's make the most of it. And universities are the place that's going to happen. I'm not a big fan of Churchill, but I do like this quote: "Never let a good crisis go to waste." So with that, I'll just say thank you and stay well. And thank you to Vineet, Pallavi, and Natasha for organizing this. And I'm very, very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Sarma, for a fantastic talk. We were hanging on to every word, as we always do whenever we hear you speak. Thank you so much for your time and for doing this. Thanks a lot to the audience as well for joining in and listening through. I'm Pallavi. Me and my colleague Natasha here are going to moderate the questions ahead. So please type in your questions in the Q&A tab, and do not type them in the chat tab, just type them in Q&A. And if possible, do also mention your name and designation, just so we have the context. Professor Sarma, just so you know, the audience that we have here today is extremely diverse, as we can tell from what they've been writing on the chat. And there are educators, faculty, students, entrepreneurs, businessmen from all over the world. And I'm sure the questions are going to reflect that diversity. So we're looking forward to this. Okay. So while we look through the questions, there's one thing that we wanted to ask you, and we'll begin with that. So currently you're leading digital learning for MIT. If the same mandate was to be passed on for India, if you were to lead digital learning in an Indian context for the country, how would you do that, and where would you begin?
Well, first of all, India has a pioneering effort in digital learning. It started with the I've forgotten the name. It's done out of the IITs. One of you will probably remember it, but it's quite extraordinary actually. And but what I would do is, I've never felt that online learning should ever be by itself when we have the luxury of proximity. What I would do is I would flip the classrooms. I would have students prepare content. And when they come to campus, make sure they've read the content with using online quizzes, etc. And then on the campus, when you have proximity, then you do the labs, the homeworks, the building projects, the applied projects. Even Socrates talked about applied philosophy. So that's what I would do. But then when a crisis like this hits, you still have the online. The other advantage of online is, for example, in Bangalore, the traffic is so bad, it's very difficult to get to the university. So you can also go off hours, you can do in-person classrooms on the weekends, you can do labs on the weekends, you can do all sorts of other exciting things. But let's not be so wedded to a system that India got from the British and from Europe that we follow slavishly at a time when change is both demanded and not so difficult.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Sarma, for your amazing insights. The next two questions are actually related, so I'm going to combine them. In the Indian context, where we have deeply rooted inequalities in the education system, how can online learning and education technology play the role of an equalizer? And adding to that, will higher education become less accessible after COVID, considering most people do not have means to access the technology the way we do, especially in the Indian context?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that I actually have always felt that education delivered well is the great equalizer. Certainly IIT from all those years ago, if you had access to Brilliance or Agarwal or something, you had a better shot at getting in coaching classes. So there's certainly a privilege did give those of us who had access to it, and I had access it gives you an unfair advantage. But on the other hand, within IIT, we had some really brilliant students who came from backgrounds and circumstances that to me are hard to imagine. And to me, they were just amazing and inspiring. And they were smarter than all of us. So I do think that education is the great equalizer. That's point number one. Point number two, in a country like India, or even in America, by the way, you cannot take things like online access, bandwidth, computers for granted. And so in my view, what India needs to do is repeat an effort, to keep trying to do what happened a few years ago with the Indian tablet project on the one hand, and infrastructure. Even as much as we want to build, we need to build roads, and we want to build roads, but internet access and communication infrastructure has to be central. And the third thing I would do is recreate a modern version of online education with online automatic grading, FAQs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think India is set for this, and this is the right time. In the past, I've visited India, met the government, et cetera, and advocated for this. But there are always 300 reasons not to do something, and only one reason to do it. And the one reason to do it is it's the right thing to do. And it's, you're looking into the future. COVID, hopefully, if there's one thing, a few things will come out of this tragedy, but I hope one of them is to treat the power of online, not just as a resiliency measure, but also as a measure that gives that equalizes people.
The question that we're getting from a lot of people is along the lines of implementation challenges. So for a lot of people to whom this is extremely new, including both faculty and students, what are the practical challenges that one faces in terms of implementation, and how can we overcome those?
Well, clearly the biggest challenge, frankly, is the culture. Changes of culture happen in times of crisis. World War II, World War I. These are times when people become aware of other options and are forced to adopt them. But the biggest challenge is culture, because I'm doing things this way, it seems to work. And of course, no change is discontinuous, not sudden. So you say, nothing's changing, and you just keep going. And building a sense of urgency, building a national momentum towards this is what it takes. And at MIT, even at MIT, it wasn't easy to do this. I've been doing this for 7 years, 8 years, but people have finally got it. With COVID, suddenly, of course, everyone knows why it's valuable. But in India, a country as big as India, I think it's culture. I mean, take, for example, the lockdown that has occurred. I mean, that was quite an extraordinary move. And by the way, I hope India does not stop it too soon. But it took leadership to do that. And I think culture comes from leadership, and leadership has to step up to this.
Just building on to the previous question, there are a few people who've asked, this comes from Professor Pushpendra Singh from IIIT Delhi. How do you think practicals will change, for example, chemistry labs or other hands-on disciplines like robotics? And just adding to that, we have one more question from Sarika Bhattacharya, who's the founder of Beyond Diversity. How can we make education more experiential in online platforms?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I can't be glib here. I mean, obviously you can't do a chemistry lab in person. And that's why proximity is that great elixir that we've lost, and it's telling us that when you're on campus, focus on those things, right? Now, having said that, I think we're going to start making some progress in never perfectly replicating, but giving a sense of some of these practical things in person. And I want to tell you a little story. I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to pause for a second, and I want you to think about it. There is one industry which would not be commercially viable today were it not for virtual reality. And this virtual reality has been available for, I would say, almost 100 years, maybe 80 years. Then I want you to think about what that industry is. Okay. By the way, I'm playing a trick on you. I'm trying to generate dopamine and curiosity. So I'm using the very trick that I talked about. So that industry, ladies and gentlemen, is aviation. If you had to train pilots in the air, it would be too expensive. And instead we have flight simulators, and flight simulators have been around for a very long time. And flight simulators are a way to do practicals online. Now, of course, it's never the same as flying a plane, but at least you reduce the time it takes to actually learn in the air. And I think it's a matter of time before we figure out how to do chemistry, other things. But if I can't teach welding or surgery online. There are simulations that get you there, but eventually go to a cadaver and then you go to a real human being. In terms of equity, I actually think the bottom line is infrastructure, access, and safe places. For example, if you live in Dharavi right now, I mean, of course, it's always difficult. In time of COVID, it's even more difficult. But where would you go and sit with like-minded children or young people or even young adults and study? Do you have access to a laptop? Do you have access to a tablet? Do you have access to headphones so that you don't disturb people in close proximity? I think that is where we need to put our focus. India, which is in some ways historically one of the oases of knowledge, has an opportunity to fundamentally rethink its economy around learning. And I think it ought to.
Sarma, this question is from Pramod Tripathi. He says that with an outdated British education system still widespread in our education system, and teaching is directly related to assessment, how do you think technology can change that system?
Well, I think people will start voting with their feet. If education systems don't evolve, people will start voting with their feet. If you're an 18-year-old and you can take an online course and become a nurse, of course, the regulatory authorities can also sort of limit it. Or if you can start programming in a company and there's no regulatory requirement for a degree to go work at Infosys, if you're a fantastic programmer, why would you go to university? I actually think universities are very valuable, by the way. You grow as a human being, you become more mature, you become more resilient, you can connect the dots, you learn practical things, you also, in my view, learn lateral thinking in a university. So I think they're very valuable. But if you don't focus on the things that make universities actually valuable, that is when you have proximity, then why would a young person go to university? I actually want to predict to you, in fact, there's another McKinsey study, I was going to put this up, that if a few thousand colleges will die in America in the next 10 years. Retailers, there's going to be mayhem in the retail industry and in the small private college industry. It's a tragedy because these colleges actually do a lot. It's very valuable, right? But if you don't, adapt, you won't survive, because you have a generation of young people who will have spent a year training to educate themselves using online content. You cannot go back to the old world, just like a retailer can't go back to the old world. So actually what I think universities should do is start offering online content for people in the working world, people in their own students, so that students can get the content that way. So, and when they come into the classroom, they're going to ask their professors tough questions, and professors will have to step up to the challenge.
Yeah, go ahead.
Voice is a little, there's some network issue.
Whose voice? Mine?
Yeah, okay, now we can hear you.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the next question is from Syed Abdul. What's your take on 90% drop rate after joining any massive open online courses? The lack of motivation and difficulty to continue in online learning is very high. How can we overcome it?
That's why I am a believer in blended learning, right? That's why I think universities actually do have a role, because the scaffolding that universities provide by motivating, making students curious, providing hands-on opportunities, projects, that's actually very important. So I'm not in any way saying that online is better than universities. I think universities have to get better at what they're good at. They speak precisely to Abdul's question, which is what I just said. So the online should be a support to universities, right? But if the universities don't do what they're supposed to be good at, then the online will win.
So India is among the few countries where a lot of greenfield universities are coming up. So for an institution that comes up from scratch post-COVID, how would you say it should reinvent itself? What should it do differently?
Okay, let's not talk.
Blended learning.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so for an institution that's coming up from scratch and it doesn't have any concerns around legacy, what would it do differently from the beginning?
Yeah, let's not talk about universities for a second. Let's take retail. Okay. Let's say that you have a new retail opportunity. Maybe you sell, I don't know, sports equipment, cricket bats, cricket balls, cricket kits. Okay. Maybe they're really cool and they have some new technology. Would you set up a bunch of shops, one in Bangalore, one in Madras, one in New Delhi, one in Gurgaon, one in Chandigarh? Is that the first thing you would do? Probably not. What you likely will do is think of an online strategy, or what is called an omni-channel strategy, where you set up an online shop, you strike deals with local retailers, right? You maybe have a few showrooms, right? So universities, that's for retail. That's not the same for universities. But I think a university cannot start today without having an online strategy. And the point of the online strategy is not to replace the university. It is to make the university stronger. So when you come to campus, it's like going to Disney World. It's a knowledge, it's a temple of knowledge where you have fun and you're learning and you're trying things out. So that's the way I think about it. I would say that your online strategy is as important whether you're in retail or in education today.
Professor Sarma, we have a lot of school teachers in the audience as well, and one of them has asked this question, Shiladitya Ghosh. What can you predict about how the schools are going to change in the future, given that teachers are mostly used to teaching for the exams, although they are right now teaching using Zoom, but they're pretty much doing what they do in a live class?
I wish I could give you a super hopeful answer. I think it has to change completely. I think what we're doing is we're teaching students to ace exams and forget everything basically a few days later. And if you think that that's an exaggeration, in fact, there is something called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And if you're interested, you can check it out, Ebbinghaus. And it turns out that if you cram for an exam, you'll do well in the exam, but you'll forget. Now, I unfortunately believe that this requires cultural change. And sadly, a lot of our gates are based on exam. In fact, the IIT entrance exam for graduate school used to be called GATE, ironically. But a lot of those gates are exams. So it'll take a long time before we really value capability. But I think that as the economy becomes more distributed and you're less judged on whether you graduated from a top school and more judged on whether you're a good programmer, you're less judged on whether you went to a great architecture school, but you're more judged by your portfolio of designs. I think that's where the pressure on exams will go down, but that's a long-term thing. And we're trying to do that in America as well. It's not trivial. But my suggestion to you is you have to carry that spirit in your heart and keep trying to do it, although exams will continue to remain important.
This question is from Sitaram Soni. It's asking that how will the gamification change the teaching learning process?
There are two forms of gamification. One is a cheapening form of gamification. One is an enriching form of gamification. A cheapening form of gamification is where you gamify it and the game dominates. And it's all about quick rewards, right? It's by itself not a terrible thing, but it's not where you want to go. But there is something to be said for something called what people call serious games. And the idea is that you gamify things in a much more, it's fun still, but in a serious way. So for example, you problem solve, So you take a true, like for example, I do a lot of consulting. I could take one of my consulting projects and turn it into a game where by learning certain knowledge, you unlock certain skills, but you're actually living through some experience that I had to go through in solving a problem. Why did this thing crack? Well, here's why, right? It's almost like a Sherlock Holmes mystery. I think that has a lot of value. And in fact, good professors, in my view, sort of do that. They work that into their lectures as well. But I think problem sets can be designed that way. You can gamify a problem set, right? And you can gamify interaction online that way. So when I talk about I do like gamification, but I would say focus on really thinking through the pedagogical content and make it fun as well. But not so much, you're jumping off something and landing somewhere. And if you can add two numbers, but you lose point. That is also fine, I guess, just to get kids into it. But sometimes you lose the math aspect and you get lost in the visual aspect.
Changing gears a bit here and talking more at the policy level, this question comes from Hitesh Sharma. Unlike US, India has a diversity of education institutions. We have universities, colleges, standalone institutions, and most of them are administered by state. So what immediate steps can the Indian government and related ministries can take to bring the suggested changes?
First of all, you've got to recognize the problem. If you don't recognize the problem, I think there's one, as an Indian died in the wool. I left India when I was 20-something years old. I say this with a lot of love and admiration. I think one of our problems is complacency. When things are not blowing up, we think everything's fine. And when things change slowly, we don't see the slow change until it's too late. I think that the first most important thing is to declare an emergency. Now, COVID just accelerated it by 5-10 years, but this, in some ways, this emergency is like climate change. No one pays attention to climate change right now, right? COVID is like climate change, it's a micro version of climate change accelerated into 1 month period, right? So education is like climate change. We have to take this on at a massive scale. It comes down from leadership, recognize the problem, and you got to shake people out of their comfort zones. Hopefully COVID will help with that, and get every institution to examine every assumption about education that has been baked into their psyches from British times. And that's a leadership effort. I'm sorry. It's hard enough for me to do it with 1,000 faculty colleagues at MIT. At a national level, it can be done. It can be done.
This question is from an employer perspective. They want to know about what is the effectiveness of an online degree.
I would say
some
that
studies that evaluate that.
Yeah, I would say that it, first of all, depends on the field. And second, I would say that in any case, a good university which takes advantage of proximity delivers, in my view, a better education and a better degree than anything that you can do online. And I'm Mr. Online, I'm saying this, right? So there's no doubt about that. The problem is a lot of universities don't take advantage of the proximity. That's the point I've been making. Now, it also depends on the field. For example, can you teach programming online? Mostly. Now, I actually think programming is a team skill, by the way, because when you program, when you write code, you do code reviews, you do pair programming, you have things like that. But that you can do sort of more remotely. So maybe things like programming, yeah, I think you can do pretty well online, right? Would you ever fly a plane where the pilot says to you, well, I have an online degree in piloting aircraft? Probably not, right? So there's a spectrum. Would you do management? Can you do management online? Well, some management techniques you can teach online, project planning, etc. But in the end, the person may have difficulty getting along with other people, and you won't see that in person until they're in person, right? Or they may need coaching in some respect about the way they're thinking. You can't do that if you're not in person. Of course, if the university doesn't do it, then the online is just as good. If the university does it, it can be a lot better. It's like seeing your doctor or going to a hospital. Is online telemedicine the same as going to a hospital? Well, for some things, yes. I mean, if you trust your doctor and you say, I have, and it's a condition that the doctor understands, yeah, they can prescribe stuff you and have the medicine delivered. But in the end, it involves, a stethoscope. It involves all these other things. It involves maybe even asking you questions, feeling your pulse. So it's the same thing. There's a spectrum.
Our next question is from Professor James Shanahan. Internships are a great form of learning. In the COVID-19 season, many internships have evaporated. What can universities, industry, governments, and even students do to provide an alternative, putting the rubber to road type of experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. We're struggling with that as well. I think that online internships will start to take off, actually. It's, in my view, always been in the offing, and it was a matter of time. And now, again, it depends on how creative the company is and so on. But online internships have to take off. Now, it won't apply, you can't do it in every field, but in many fields, you can do it. So for example, let's say certainly data analysis, programming, of course, you can do online internships. But even things like healthcare, you can give people reading assignments, you can see how analytical they are, how they're able to digest information. You can teach them how to digest information, put things in perspective. So a lot of the in-person coaching you can do this way. Can you do a machining, machine operation or a manufacturing internship online? 30%, right? Because in the end, you need to be on the factory floor. Welding, can you teach welding online? I like welding. Yeah, you can teach the physics, you can show how it looks, but until you are welding and you can feel the heat and the sparks, you're not really there. So it's a spectrum, but I do think universities must have to experiment with online internships. And universities and companies, both. Also companies, hopefully the economy will come back. They're going to have to recruit people. So this is a way for them to identify candidates.
This is an anonymous question. The person wants your views on homeschooling.
Very interesting question. Look, all the science of learning tells us, this should be no surprise, the human being is we're a social animal, which is what COVID has attacked, but we're also a learning animal. The human being is the most helpless baby of all animals, pretty much, and helpless for the longest time. We only become adults in our late teens, and for some of us, never, I guess. Now, that's because we are evolved to learn, and we're also evolved to teach. That's what parents do. Parents teach. So homeschooling done right, in my view, is actually quite valuable. The problem is there are a lot of techniques and content that parents may or may not know. But a committed parent with homeschooling can do very well. Of course, the challenge is social exposure, learning to deal with life, all that stuff is something that you have. Sports, I'm a big believer in sports. Clubs, things like that you would lose. But if you can build other ecosystems to give that, I think homeschooling is pretty good, but the parents have to be both knowledgeable and committed. By the way, I should say that it slipped my mind. I talked about India's pioneering efforts in online. I would say NPTEL, that's the word that slipped my mind. NPTEL is amazing. I still sometimes I haven't done it recently, but I used to go to NPTEL. So.
Great. It's in the interest of time, I will ask the final question, and it's pretty broad, but I think this is the right time to ask it, considering most of the audience is very passionate about the subject of education. What, in your view, is true disruption in education right now?
Unfortunately, it's very hard to answer that question because it's so multidimensional. There's so many dimensions in which education is being disrupted. For example, maybe we shouldn't educate students in one campus, but in 3 campuses. Maybe 1 year they're in one campus, 1 year they're in another campus, 1 year they're in another campus, right? That's pretty disruptive. Or maybe they should be on a ship that goes to different countries, right? That's very expensive, etc. But that's a high-end disruption. I actually think the biggest disruption is going to be what we're just going through right now, which is if you can learn online. And by the way, companies like Khan Academy, Sal Khan, who's at least partly of Indian descent, in my view, the more famous Salman Khan is Sal Khan. If you look at people like that, they've been putting these online things into the ether. And I think that COVID has forced us to really take advantage of it. So the real disruption is going to be universities figuring out how to be universities. Ironically, proximity, taking advantage of proximity. To me, the ones that figure that out will win. because companies will hire from those universities more because they will produce better product. So to me, I would say maybe leave it at that and just say it is the power of proximity.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarma, for a very, very enlightening last hour. We'd invite you here to just make some closing comments to the audience. The kind of diversity that's there in the audience, educators, students, entrepreneurs, faculty, businessmen. Any comments that you'd want to make to everyone, in last thoughts you'd want to leave them with?
Yeah, I think that I'll just end with this. Times of crises are times of change. They give us to use the Arabic word, the ijazat, to make change. They give us the permissions to make change, the license to make change. And in so many respects, India has made changes. The whole info IT revolution is one of them. India is a very different country than the one I left more than a quarter century ago. It's quite extraordinary, actually. But in my view, the Indian psyche is one of knowledge. In fact, the word knowledge, which is Knowledge, is the same root as Gnan, Gnan, right? Gyan. That's from Greek, and Indian knowledge is from Gnan. It's the same root. And to me, and also Indian adherence to knowledge actually cuts across religions, society, learning. It cuts across all of them, right? Whether it's the Sufi tradition, whether it's the Buddhist tradition, the Jain tradition, the math, I feel that just as Bollywood has pervaded India, with some good effects, some bad effects, I feel that India needs to bet on learning and knowledge. And I hope that this crisis will trigger that. So thank you very much. And it's been a real pleasure to I guess, see you all on chat and virtually.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarma, for your time. And thanks a lot to the wonderful audience that joined us here today. Thank you for all of your questions and all of your engagement. Please forgive us for not being able to answer all the questions. In the interest of time, we could only take a few. But please stay tuned to this channel. The Plaksha Tech Talks have just started. This was the inaugural lecture, and many more are going to follow. So stay tuned to wait for the next speaker, which will be released soon.
Thanks.
Stay safe. Have a nice evening.
Bye.